Hello everyone and welcome to the final show of the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy Friday to you all. And to conclude this week's edition of shows, we always do our stardom sit-em segments and then transition to some big games this weekend in terms of fantasy implications. And then, of course, towards the end, talk a little bit more about Sunday Night Football and that bizarre match between the Bengals and Chargers in terms of fantasy advice, specifically who to start and who to sit there. It should be a very fun week-ending show. But before we get into any of all that good stuff, I do want to remind you that if you want to view more content such as this across more platforms, whether it be our website, on TikTok, things of that nature, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network wherever you may be able to find us. However, if you do want to interact with this show and others more directly around the network, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can do three things. Go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, leave a tip or donation there, or you can do it through YouTube by pressing the $ in the chat box in your comments section, or if you just feel like leaving any burning questions, comments, or concerns that you have throughout the show. And that way is the last way to go about contributing, and I'll be able to read them on screen. It's perhaps the most fun way you can contribute as well, because I love hearing your guys' opinions on things, especially certain segments I like trying out week in, week out. But without further ado, let's jump right into today's show. Should be a good one, starting off with our first segment of the day. Speaking of starts and sits, starting off as always with my favorite starts of the week. And what that means is, throughout the week, I've compiled lists of each position in terms of who I believe could be viable options to start. Maybe some long shots get thrown in there. I then, at the end of the week, right now, start talking about which of them at each position are the best starts, in my humble opinion, for you this week. It's a great way to get you prepared at the last minute for Sunday's games. But, as always, let me know what you think about them in the comments, because I love doing this. It's a fun little exercise to get you ready for the weekend. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off, as always, with the QB position, and this one is very bizarre. You might be a little bit skeptical about this guy, especially in the fantasy football world, but I think in terms of matchups, you can't get any better than this, and he's coming into this week after a very down week last week in prime time against Miami. So, I'm going to say the best start of the week at the QB position for me is Matthew Stafford. Now, I know what you're thinking. Matthew Stafford has never been a likable quarterback, at least in fantasy football terms. He is one of those guys who, in the league in real life, has been very consistent year in, year out, even into his late 30s, where he is now. But he's never really had the stats translate to a fantasy landscape. And so no one's really ever been that hyped about him from a fantasy perspective. However, there are certain matchups where you get a Matthew Stafford that can produce for you at a consistent level, and this game I'm looking at in this week's lineup, it's one of the worst games of the week, where they're heading into Foxborough to take on New England, who, mind you, have steadily improved on the defensive side of the football, but this, like I said, is a Rams team that's kind of pissed off right now. They did not live up to their standards against Miami at home. They looked abysmal on offense, even with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. And it was not what people expected to see from them, considering the fact that this was their second game with a fully healthy offense. However, what I was impressed with was in those short moments where Matthew Stafford looked himself. He was making some of the most impressive throws of any quarterback we've seen all season. So we know that Matthew Stafford isn't necessarily the problem, right? And now, going up against a Patriots team that's still feisty, but not necessarily that competitive, I think that Matthew Stafford has an opportunity to have one of those games where you can't ignore from a fantasy perspective, and most importantly, from a matchups perspective. People have been using the Patriots every single week, perhaps, to justify starting someone at any position. And so, why not start Matthew Stafford? I know it's a little bit far out because, like I said, Matthew Stafford's not the most appealing fantasy quarterback out there, but this is a Matthew Stafford right now that knows what's at stake. He knows his team wants to reach its goals, and they're still in front of them. And so, week in, week out, look for him to continue to steadily improve, with this week being the benchmark and springboard for future success for him this season. So that's why I think at the QB position, you can't go wrong with Matthew Stafford, no matter how weird and awkward it may seem. Then the running back position, another kind of underrated guy in a very tough physical matchup for him. How about James Cook on my personal fantasy team? A guy who I've had kind of be patient with. He's had his peaks and valleys this season, a lot of stellar performances, a lot of unnoteworthy performances as well, where he's not necessarily been the guy you want him to be. But I feel like in this very pivotal AFC matchup, a matchup that we've seen so many times before, James Cook will be of huge importance here, because I feel like in order to attack that Chiefs defense, you either have to do one of two things. You can either try and test him vertically, much like the Broncos tried to do in the first half with Nix and Sutton, or you can try to stretch them horizontally, where you use the screen game, get them moving, use motion to confuse them a little bit more. And I think the Bills are well equipped to do that, especially with a guy like James Cook, who's so versatile out of the backfield. He's not necessarily going to have to carry the load from a running perspective, because they like balancing the run with the screen game, with the short to intermediate passing game. But I still think he impacts this game, especially in the red zone, and especially on late downs when they're trying to sustain drives to keep Patrick Mahomes and that Chiefs offense off the field. And so, for as long as the Bills can hold the ball, James Cook is going to have to be a huge integral part of that, because I think the Bills are going to want to play the long game here. I think they want to maintain possession and keep the Chiefs off the field. But to do that, you're going to have to attack this defense head on. And I think the best way to do it for the Bills is to, like I said, try some horizontally continue doing what you're doing in the short passing game, because that's where the Bills thrive, and James Cook can thrive as a very solid running and receiving back. So look for him to have a huge day in a huge matchup for the Bills. Then the wide receiver position, kind of messed this one up a little bit, because yesterday was Terry McLaurin who was going to pick now, but I'm thinking of who I potentially pick as a switch option, and I'm looking at, some of the bigger matchups this week, like Ravens, Steelers, a lot of exciting receivers here. I think about Chiefs, Bills. What could, DeAndre Hopkins and Amari Cooper do for these respective teams? But then I look at Seahawks 49ers. This is an interesting game for both wide receiver cores. For Seattle, I've talked about them all week. DK Metcalf is finally back, so he brings a different dimension to this team now. And you still have Tyler Lockett and JSN, who's coming off a career game against LA 2 weeks ago, and Tyler Lockett's just one of the most reliable receivers in the league. And then on the 49ers side of things, you also have a wealth of talent at your disposal. And the two players that I think are going to be key in this game are JSN, whether or not he can maintain that solid performance that he had 2 weeks ago against a very physical divisional opponent yet again. And then on the 49ers side of things, Jawan Jennings. I was completely wrong about Terry McLaurin. I actually did not watch most of this game last night, but apparently he did not have a good one. So in his stead, I'm going to be talking about two more understated wide receivers who I think can grow into the final weeks of the season for their respective teams. And look at the NFC West. This is a division rife with talent, especially from a fantasy perspective. You can go down all of these rosters, just look at their incredible depth. From Arizona down to Seattle in last, every single team has some sort of fantasy upside to it. So this Seattle 49ers game should be very appealing to fantasy football managers everywhere. So ignore the fact that my initial pick was Terry McLaurin. I completely forgot that I would be talking about this after the events of Thursday night's game. But a solid replacement could stem from that NFC West matchup. Then let's go to the tight ends and get over that embarrassing little moment there. How about an easy tight end to pick week in, week out? Travis Kelce. Whereas the Bills, we kind of know their MO, their identity, their ways of wanting to go about this game. With the Chiefs, I feel like it's a very similar kind of identity as well. Because you think about the Chiefs moving the football, they've become more methodical after the absence of Tyreek Hill, and now trying to transition into a new frontier for this not necessarily less talented receiving core, but kind of more versatile one to kind of put it in a positive bent here. But out of all of these skill position talents, Travis Kelce is one who you know can consistently move the chains. And as a tight end, your main job being to either block for others or exploit certain coverages, there's no one better at doing that in big moments, in big games for that matter, than Travis Kelce. This game is meant for him. And so you may like other appealing options, maybe younger options out there as well, guys that I mentioned perhaps in my tight end rankings this week. But I still think for what it's worth, Travis Kelce you can't go wrong with, even though this is the toughest matchups the Chiefs will have this season, potentially outside of, say, the Texans and Steelers coming up down the road. This is the matchup, and Travis Kelce has to be the guy for the Chiefs to stay in this game long enough they feel they can win it towards the end. So look for Travis Kelce to be a huge X factor of the tight end position this week. And last but not least, the defense. This one's a little bit of a long shot to some people, a little bit contentious in the fantasy football landscape this week, but the Steelers, I believe, against this Ravens team, can get the job done. Remember, Lamar Jackson does not have a solid record. I believe it's only 1-3 against Pittsburgh. This may seem like a different Ravens offense with the addition of Derrick Henry, but I still think there's no defense more well-rounded and most importantly well-equipped up front to handle both of these guys. If you know Lamar can be better downfield in the passing game and try and hurt that secondary, which I believe is perhaps the weakest part of this defense, then they might have a shot at, getting some big explosive plays in this team. But the Steelers up front are just too savvy, too physical, too fearsome for me to think that they can sustain drives with either a Lamar design run or Derrick Henry trying to wear them down. Because Derrick Henry, I feel like, grows into games at this point in his career, and the Steelers won't allow you to do that. So that's why I feel like, even though it's not necessarily the best of matchups for the Steelers defense, they have the physicality on the front end that can compensate for the back end, because I'm not necessarily threatened, in my opinion, by Lamar's passing attack as much as I am worried about him creating out of structure with his speed. So if you can contain his speed, you can contain this offense, most likely. And I think the Steelers can do that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Coming up next, though, we have to transition from starts to sits. Which guys do I think you should leave on the bench this week? We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody...
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you wish to interact with the show a little bit more directly throughout its duration, consider making yourselves available for the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to contribute and interact with the show. You can go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, leave a tip or donation there, or you can do it directly through YouTube by pressing the $sign in the chat box in the comment section, or you can just leave a question, comment, or concern you may have throughout the show. I'll be able to read it on air. Love getting your guys' opinions on things. It just makes the show that much more smooth and thus much better. But without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of the day. We go from good to bad. From guys who I think could be penciled into your roster immediately to guys who can ride it out on the bench this week. And it's always tough, trying to figure out matchups where people you feel like can definitively sit games out for you in fantasy. But I'm starting to see certain patterns of games that really take up the national spotlight and games where it's starting to become a little bit easier based off of matchup to really see certain teams who don't necessarily need to be uplifted by certain players play against teams that I just feel like are at this point better than them. So I think that all of these players are capable of having big games, but I don't necessarily feel like they're at a point in the season where their teams can sustain them because they're not necessarily playing in the high-profile games they need to be, if that makes sense. Without further ado, let's talk about them. Starting off with the guy at the QB position who's actually going to be playing against the QB who I picked in my starts. Let's talk about Drake May, because he is a solid rookie quarterback, but he's a very confounding one, because I feel like at this point in his career, it's safe to say most of the faults that we see in his game stem from other external factors or internal factors. The offensive line, perhaps not much coherence yet in terms of play calling and things of that nature, but overall, I still feel like there isn't necessarily a structure for him to key in on and learn from just yet. I feel like this is a trial by fire for him, and so he is kind of playing a little bit more off the cuff than some other rookie quarterbacks who have been in their respective systems for longer. And so I feel like in certain games, we're going to see him kind of play a little bit more timid than usual, because I feel like the Patriots matchups over the last couple of weeks were a little bit more simplified. This Rams game is very complex because I don't necessarily know which version of the Rams are going to show up, but I do know that they themselves believe that they should be winning games of this nature this late in the season because they feel they're the caliber of a playoff team. And the Patriots right now are definitely not. And so that disparity kind of leaps out at me when I look at games that aren't as thrilling and exciting as others in the league. So I feel like even though I think Stafford will have a big game and I wanted to kind of hype him up outside of, some more high-profile quarterbacks playing in high-profile games. But on the flip side of things, I have to look at Drake May and think, if I were him and I were in this system playing a game that is meaningless to me but is more meaningful for my opponent, then what's the point of even trying, really? And I feel like that's part of the frustration that's coming with being that New England Patriots quarterback, because I feel like Drake May and Jerod Mayo know his talents, and this organization knows his talents, but they're at a point where they can't trust it week in, week out. And so, as much as I think the best of Drake May, and this is not necessarily an indictment of his game, I truly believe he can have a successful career in the NFL, these games for him don't necessarily mean anything. You're not playing a team that you feel you can beat, and you're kind of playing out the season, going through the motions almost. And as good as you play, it's not necessarily going to be of any import for your team. It's just more important for your development. And so while it's a good thing for him, I can't necessarily say from a fantasy perspective at this moment in his career, week in, week out, he's going to remain as consistent as he's been against, similar competition. Because the Rams are definitely coming into this game with a vengeance after last week. So look for him to struggle in this one. And then the running back position, I picked Breece Hall mainly because not just the Jets' offense in general, but also because this is a very physical Colts front who I'm actually really liking in terms of not just their style of play, but who they played it well. They've corralled running backs like James Cook, who I picked my starts this week, like, Aaron Jones a couple of weeks ago, and they're starting to come into their own. They're starting to develop this kind of identity that screams top 10 defensive unit like a lot of people thought they would be. And so Breece Hall, who's already been struggling mightily this season, is going to have a tough test ahead of him. I think he's going to be used a lot more, perhaps, just to alleviate some of the burdens placed on Aaron Rodgers. And I hope it happens, because that's just me saying personally what I believe is best for the Jets at this point in the season if they truly want to get something out of it. But either way, this team just is not necessarily sustainable in terms of their offensive style week in, week out. You can't just go out there and say, okay, Aaron, throw to Devontae Adams X amount of times and hope he makes an explosive play, or, have Garrett Wilson make an acrobatic catch to save you in some games. It can't be the offense week in, week out for the New York Jets. And so I wish I could speak more positively of Breece Hall, because he could be their saving grace this season. But I think they're underutilizing him. That's what's taking the kind of excitement and hype surrounding him as a fantasy prospect away, because they've really diminished his role this year, and I feel like they should have bolstered him a little bit more instead of, focusing on Aaron Rodgers doing it all back there, because Aaron Rodgers looks more lost than Breece Hall was when he was playing with guys that were much worse than Aaron Rodgers, ironically, like Zach Wilson and Tim Boyle and Trevor Siemian. So it's an affront to Breece Hall to kind of take away his importance from the team. So as much as I wish he weren't on this list this week, it's kind of out of necessity. It's kind of out of what I'm seeing from the Jets this season. Now, the wide receiver position, another simple one here, because this guy's just truly been a disappointment. This team has been a disappointment all year. It's got to be Calvin Ridley, because this has to be the toughest matchup for any receiver in the National Football League now against this Lions defense that suddenly has its secondary becoming its strength. And they still don't even have Zadarius Smith up front, so this defense is just getting ever more scarier. But in terms of the matchups for Ridley, I just feel like it's too reliant on, this connection between him and Will Levis. Actually, I'm thinking about the Jaguars. I don't know why, because he wasn't the Jaguars. They're facing the Vikings, which might even be worse because their secondary might not necessarily be the most popular in the NFL by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still one that is going to immediately harass Will Levis and thus kind of neuter any connection that Will Levis and Calvin Ridley might have tried to develop. And the thing is, there was no connection to begin with, so this matchup already is sucky for Calvin Ridley. And so I feel like, Calvin Ridley is one of those receivers where time has passed him by. His career is passing him by. And languishing on a Titans team without a definitive answer, whether it be at the quarterback position or organizationally, you have to be frustrated. Because I feel that at least when DeAndre Hopkins was there, this was a shared experience of ineptitude for this Tennessee Titans offense, because at least there were two guys who had felt like, their careers are over the hump a little bit and they're riding out the season with this bad team. But now DeAndre Hopkins is gone, and it's just Ridley sitting there languishing with this team. So I can't week in, week out justify having him. And then real quickly, to sum it all up, at the tight end position, it's Kyle Pitts. I just feel like this no-name Broncos defense is the kind of typical defense you would expect can immediately dominate this Falcons offense. They can generate pressure on Cousins and thus limit his passing abilities and force him to throw the football a little bit less accurately, and thus Kyle Pitts suffers, even though he's going to be the one trying to break down this Broncos defense, getting behind the linebackers, exploiting their zone coverages. But I just don't see it because this Broncos defense is for real. They're very physical, and I really like what they've been doing. And last but not least, let's go to the defense and special teams. That's what I was thinking with the Jags. The Jags against the Lions, because nobody wants to face this Lions offense. No matter how, intriguingly well this Jaguars team has played against great competition, I still don't see a path where they can truly dominate and ultimately win this matchup against the Lions offense. They're just ticking in every single department. So that's why I have to take the Jaguars to sit this one out. And who really wants to play the Jaguars defense anyway in any matchup? Because, like I said, they could be good in some weeks, but they're never, a defense that ultimately wins you games in real life or in fantasy. So that's why they find themselves on this list. But that should just about do it for all my starts and sits for the week, except for my last segment, which will be really fun. But now, right after this short break, we get into some implications, specifically in the NFL, and some big games for this week. How does it affect your fantasy team? We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment here of the day, we're going to be switching from some stardom cinema advice for the time being and head into some big games at both the NFL and college football with some pretty big fantasy implications. And I feel like this weekend in games in the NFL, I could have picked a number of them. And limiting myself to 4 felt a little bit crazy because this is the week where a lot of things can be said about certain teams. We find out their identities and whether or not they're actual contenders or not. And I had to, kind of parse through some games that were difficult to put on this list, but still make it fresh as to where I'm not dominating this list by putting all the big games this weekend, like Ravens Steelers, for example, or even a game like Bengals Chargers, that bizarre matchup for Sunday night. So I tried to balance it with games that, could be appealing and games that I know are marquee matchups and you're going to be sitting in front of the TV for watching them wholeheartedly. But without further ado, let's just jump right into these interesting games this week. And starting off with a game that I really feel could go under the radar just because one of these teams' seasons is practically over. And the other just came off a very heartbreaking loss that could have been one of the best wins by any team in the National Football League this year. And it just makes for a very interesting storyline taking place down in Texas, where the Texans take on the Cowboys. And I feel like this game is one in which you have to understand that even though the Cowboys feel down and out, and the question that I put on the screen seems a little bizarre and a little bit skeptical, I feel like there are ways in which this game can be a bit more fun and exciting in both real life and fantasy. Let's start with the Cowboys side of things. Like I said, I still have some glimmer of optimism for this Cowboys offense. I actually think this Cowboys defense can steadily improve this season. They now bring back Micah Parsons. DeMarcus Lawrence seems healthy at this point in the season. But let's talk about this Cowboys offense because I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about it than other people, perhaps because of this quote-unquote freedom I feel that they can have. Last week, yes, it was a very difficult matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, and I knew that perhaps it wasn't necessarily going to be pretty. But in this stretch for the Cowboys, I feel like we're going to start to learn about the anxieties this team might have had with the pressure that Dak had on his shoulders and what CD means to this team as well. And how it kind of takes over the culture of a team. Because I feel like there aren't many winnable games left in this schedule. They have a nice little stretch where they take on the Giants, the Bengals, and the Panthers. Maybe they steal 2 of those games. But I feel like the point that I'm trying to make here stems from the tension being lifted in some areas. And so that's why I feel like while Cooper Rush isn't necessarily going to be flashy, he might not be the quote-unquote savior of this team by a long shot, because I do believe this season is over in Dallas. I feel like there are opportunities for this offense and some secondary players to actually get going because they don't have to worry about any links between the organization and what they feel Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb should be doing. And so that can really help a team. And once you know this season is over and this Cowboys team can look themselves in the mirror, they can turn a page here. And once Dak is healthy, they can start, getting to terms with what this team can become because this disaster of a season is finally over. And not for nothing, there might be some noise about Micah Parsons' contract, and how he wants to be one of the highest paid defensive players of all time. But at least it's not, 2 of your most important offensive players who already had so much pressure on them for not delivering over the past couple of years. So that's why I think on the Cowboy side of things, even though Cooper Rush is not an appealing guy, he can still, distribute the ball to more people and get them more involved. So it's a blueprint for what could happen next year when this offense could be clicking a little bit more. The Texans side of things, I feel like, we know what this offense is. It can put up enough points to get you wins, but it's not as impressive as the last seasons where, Jay Stroud looked a little bit more comfortable. This year he seems to be forcing things a little bit more. But I'm really excited to see this defense in action, even though this seems like a matchup they can easily dominate in. I still think that the Cowboys, if they let Cooper Rush just settle in, can win this game in a dominant fashion. No, not necessarily a dominant fashion, but can keep this game close. That's what I'm trying to say here. But I feel like this Texans defense is really what's going to carry in the future. And even though this is not necessarily the best matchups for them, I mean, in terms of seeing if they're for real or not, I think that the game against the Lions proved that it could be their saving grace come playoff time against some very loaded AFC offenses at this point in the season. So look for this to be, kind of a litmus test for the Texans and kind of a blueprint for the Cowboys, if that makes sense. Then the second game I want to talk about, perhaps the surprise game of the weekend, in my opinion. Falcons going up against the Broncos. And I feel like both of these teams are very similar in that one unit seemingly carries them over the other. I think for the Falcons, it's their offense, because when it clicks, it can get going. And they have a lot of young weapons that everyone knows about at this point. And they have a distributor of the football in Kirk Cousins, who, when unpressured, really can put up gaudy numbers that wins you fantasy games and in real life. That's the thing. Pressure gets to him. And so, as a lot of Vikings fans know, and what some Falcons fans are trying to figure out, is that against defenses that can generate pressure, chances are the Falcons are not going to move the ball as often. Whereas the Broncos, the defense, is one of the most surprising units in the league, and they're brilliant at generating pressure. They just had one of the better defensive performances against the Chiefs all year long. So, look for this to be one of those games where it could turn into a shootout, but for both of these units to be brought into light. The Falcons' offense, whether or not it can break down a resilient Broncos defense, and then for the weaker of the two units, the Broncos' offense taking on the Falcons' defense. Can the positives that have developed in Bo Nix's game really stand out? Or can this Falcons defense, who on paper, in the back end, A.J. Terrell, Jesse Bates, and Justin Simmons, actually play up to their names? And so that's what I think separates this game from the pack. The fact that we know the solidity of two of the units in this game, but the ambiguity of the other two units excites me. And it should excite you in terms of some already established fantasy stars. The guys like Drake London, Pitts, Robinson, potentially even Algier, showing up and standing out. The Broncos defense doing their thing, surprising people. But also how unsung heroes could emerge. And this Falcons defense can limit this bizarre Broncos offense. Or can Bo Nix have one of the better games of his career? We're going to have to see, and that's what I love about this game. It could be a shootout, like I say on my screen, but it all comes down to those two weaker units and how they perform. And that's what should excite you. And for the third matchup of the week that I chose, it's the marquee one. We finally get a matchup that kind of makes sense here from a fantasy perspective, but also potentially not as exciting as others. Chiefs, Bills. These are two, like I mentioned in my graphic, championship caliber teams. And this is a rematch that we've seen many times before in both the regular season and postseason. And we know that the Bills dominate in terms of the regular season performances, undefeated in the Patrick Mahomes era in the regular season. And then they falter in the playoffs. But this game is so bizarre, right? The Chiefs are coming in undefeated, but they haven't necessarily played like a prototypical Patrick Mahomes era Chiefs team. Whereas the Bills, I don't necessarily know who this team is, because we know they're capable of dominating teams like the Chiefs, and they've seen it year in, year out in the regular season. But who's to say that they can do this consistently? Because we've always seen the Bills in certain games falter in big moments. This game, a lot of momentum is on the Bills because they feel like the team has the best opportunity to break the streak for the Chiefs. give them their first loss of the season. So that pressure, plus the fact that I think that the Chiefs, in this matchup already have not played well, that makes me think that these two championship caliber teams might have a snooze fest. I still think, the usual fantasy players like Josh Allen and Kincaid and Cook for the Bills and Kelsey and Mahomes for the Chiefs can stand out. But I feel like that what this game comes down to is which team blinks first. Is it going to be the Bills who get overawed by the moment, or the Chiefs who kind of feel like they wait to kick into second gear? They wait, and perhaps that timidity in terms of waiting till the fourth quarter to really get into that second gear will finally come back to haunt them. So I feel like this game, much like the Falcons-Broncos, but on a much broader level, can be either a shootout, we see two of the AFC's best teams duking it out, or we see a nervous tactical battle where neither team wants to mess up. And so I can't necessarily say this will be the most attractive of fantasy games, but it is one I want to monitor. And really quickly before we head to break, as I kind of got lost in time here, the Packers-Bears game. This could be a bizarre one. Not many people are talking about this divisional match. They're overawed by the Ravens-Steelers, perhaps, and games of that magnitude. But the Packers-Bears, man, can Caleb get back on track is a big question here. Because I really think Caleb is capable of, really showing us what the Bears can be. But against the Packers defense that wants to generate takeaways, and that being one of the Bears' big problems, is holding on to the football, I feel like this game is going to be defined by the carefulness and caution of the Bears' offense, contrasted with the aggressiveness of the Packers' defense. I think a lot of Bears' weapons in this game can have telling performances, whether positive or negative, like DJ Moore especially, and DeAndre Swift, both my personal fantasy team. And on the Packers side of things, they feel like they're going to have the advantage on the defense side of the football. On the offense side of the football, they're going to want to stick with their identity. But I do like the Bears' defense as well, so look out for them as a sneaky little grab in terms of a fantasy perspective. But let me know what you think about these games in the comments. I wanted to try and keep it even between, marquee matchups and kind of low-key ones. But right after this short break, we transition from the NFL very briefly, talk about some college games. Which of these CFP potential elimination games do I think can be very intriguing? We want to find out right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into our fourth segment of the day here, I do want to address a comment we got before the break from Splash Bro about the Bears. The Bears season not quite on the line, but definitely teetering with a loss. Yeah, they are a very bizarre team. I don't know quite what to make of them at this point, as well as certain pundits around the sports world. But I do know that they're either going to be one of the surprising teams where everything starts to click for them. Caleb starts to play much like he did in that 3-week stretch before their bye when they headed to London. And in London, rather. But I do feel like this also has a chance to go off the rails. They still have not played many divisional games, and that division is going to be very tough and physical to match up against. So you're going to have to be prepared for those games, starting with this game this week against the Packers. So I think you're correct in your sentiment here about how the Bears should be wary of how their season could either improve or kind of falter in these coming weeks, because they're definitely a team that a lot of people feel just right about, but also extremely disappointed about, because there were some lofty expectations for this team. But let's get into our fourth segment of the day here. Thank you for your comments, Splash Bros, about college football games with huge implications. We definitely know about the CFP implications, but let's talk about some fantasy implications. I feel like this is the week, right, where all these top 4 or 5 teams are in bizarre matchups, and they're also on the road, which is unheard of this late in the season for a lot of these top 5 teams. But I'm not necessarily looking at those games. What I'm looking at are games that kind of fit that mold, but also I know have some sort of meaning to them. I feel like in terms of picking games, I can only pick 3 really that I saw from a real life scale and a fantasy scale that kind of matched what I was thinking about. One, obviously, perhaps the game of the week. Another, a kind of get-right game that could potentially be a pratfall. And another in the ACC that's not necessarily as meaningful now as it could have been, but still a very exciting one because the team who wins could potentially sneak into the back door of the ACC championship game. So, without further ado, let's talk about the college games with huge implications this week. Starting off with, of course, perhaps the biggest game of the week in college football, no matter what perspective you look at it from. Tennessee, Georgia. This is the CFP elimination game to end all CFP elimination games and ultimately will determine the general outlook of the SEC. Either Tennessee secures the upset win in Athens, immediately becomes the team to beat in the SEC, practically penciling their name into the SEC championship game, or Georgia escapes with a win, and they immediately become one of the more appealing 2-loss teams in the SEC, with wins over 1-loss SEC team Texas, and now 2-loss SEC team Tennessee. And so this game's importance is truly tantamount to both of these teams. However, the interesting thing is, from a fantasy perspective, there's not necessarily much talent to glean from. I feel like, hearing news about Trevor Etienne being out is a huge detriment to Georgia. Because I look at this Georgia roster, and I don't necessarily think they can sustain success on the offensive side of the football without, Etienne. He's a big part of what they do. And if they lose him for this game, which they have, Carson Beck is going to have even more weight on his shoulders. And what we've seen of him these past couple of weeks goes to show that he shouldn't, because he's come up short in some games. Yes, he had that win over Texas despite his 3 picks in that game. But more often than not, if you throw picks, teams are going to take advantage of them. And that's what this game is going to come down to. Field position. Both of these teams like to generate field position through their defenses because they know their offenses are the weaker of the 2 units. Tennessee's defense does it in a better fashion. They are the best defense, I believe, in the SEC and the country. And so this matchup is not boding well for Carson Beck, especially with the loss of Etienne, because Noah Frazier, as much as I love him, he's not a back who's primed for games of this magnitude. And who's going to step up for them in the receiver room? Is it going to be Dominic Lovett? Is it going to be Dylan Bell? Is it going to be Cash Jones? Who is going to step up for this group in the receiving game? Whereas on the Tennessee side of the football, there really isn't much on the offensive side that gives me hope outside of Dylan Sampson, an all-world running back for them, who's averaging over 5.5 yards per carry, I believe. I feel like, this game from a fantasy perspective could get a little bit crazy because we could see a hero breakout for either of these teams. For the most part, this game is going to be decided by who has shorter fields on offense, because that's where the defenses come into play. Because they're going to dominate this game, and it's not really going to matter who scores the football. It's going to matter when they score and how they score. Because I don't feel either offense is equipped to put up 30 to 35 points in this game. This is going to be a defensive slugfest. And so, as much as I want to say Dylan Bell is going to have a breakout game, Nico is going to throw for over 300 yards. It's not going to happen. Both of these teams are banged up. Even Nico himself is banged up for this one, but should be ready to go, hopefully. Trevor Etienne ruled out. So now we know that both of these teams are going to try and slug it out and see what comes of it. And so this could be a game where I can say I was completely wrong and some fantasy stars emerge. And you might want to follow their careers into the NFL. But for the most part, this game will come down to how short these offensive fields are. Because that's the quickest way to score. Because there's no way that you're going to drive down the field on either of these defenses. And that should not bode well for two of the SEC's most perplexing offenses. That's the word I was trying to find. Now let's go into the weird game of the week here that I just tried to choose. LSU going into the swamp in Gainesville to take on a Florida team that's really down and out. And I know what you're thinking. How the hell can Florida keep up with a team that in LSU, got demolished by Alabama at home, but still should manage to win this game by a margin that is very lofty? I feel like, the reason why I chose this game, because out of all of them, I feel like LSU, outside of the top 25 landscape, is the team that I feel let their season go by, but still has so much talent. And I can't quite pin my finger on, why they've lost in such a bizarre fashion. Some teams that I think they should have beaten. Remember, at the start of the season, they lost to USC when USC had a last-minute drive on them. So I kind of feel like in games of this nature for LSU, this could be a get-right game, right? Because I have faith that this team is good and a solid top 25 team that just, for some reason can't quite put it together for an entire season. But when I look at Florida, right, as down and out as they are, they're on a third-string quarterback who can't even surpass 30 passing yards. I feel like, I want to see to what level can this LSU team eliminate certain things. I want to see them come out guns blazing. Because if this LSU team comes out a little bit stagnant on both sides of the football, that shows me that perhaps we should have seen this coming all along for LSU. Because LSU was one of those sneaky teams that everyone was saying could have a chance to disrupt the outcome of the SEC, could have a chance to crash the CFP even. But I really want to see if against an inferior team that they should beat by 50 points at the very least. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but a lot of points. If they can actually do it and have a complete performance from the first to fourth quarter. Because if they don't, then maybe, that's where seeds of doubt sort of seep in and saying, oh, maybe those 3 losses actually mean something. Because at this point in the season, I feel like we look outside of the top teams in the SEC and we're trying to decipher who's for real, who could potentially deserve a spot in the playoff, and which 3 loss teams, kind of let their season get away. LSU is going to come under the microscope a lot. And so this game against Florida may just be a cupcake game for them. But I want to see it be a complete one, if that makes sense. And from a fantasy perspective, all of these players are highly capable of giving you good performances. Garrett Nussmeier, I still have faith in. Kyron Lacey, Anderson. On the Florida side of things, well, their running backs at the very least could potentially do some harm to this LSU defense. But what I'm looking for is a resounding victory for them. Last game I want to kind of touch on, it kind of went over time yet again, but I do want to touch on this game, Clemson-Pitt. Clemson-Pitt is an interesting game in that now it means a little bit less in the ACC picture, but both of these teams I still really love. I love Clemson a lot. I love Cade Klubnik and how he's proven people wrong in terms of evolving as a QB. I love Phil Maffa, perhaps the most underrated running back in the country. On the Pitt side of things, I just love their efficiency, right? It's kind of gotten away from them over the past couple of weeks, and that's the reason they're out of the ACC race. But I do love this team quite a lot because of how they can hurt teams. I like Desmond Reed. I like Eli Holstein. I like that combination of solidity that they have in the backfield. And thus, I'm looking for this to be a very tight, tense game, despite it not necessarily meaning much to either of these teams. Because this is kind of one of those fighting for pride moments where either one of these teams could have potentially gone to the CFP, competed in the ACC championship game, and won it. But this is where they stand, and they still want to beat the crap out of each other. That's how I view it. So that should be a good one. But let me know what you think in the comments, because for our last segment, we are going to go back to the NFL and talk about Sunday Night Football a little bit more extensively, namely some fantasy advice on who to start and who to sit. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the last segment of the day and the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys have enjoyed the show thus far, and for our final segment, we're going to go ahead and talk about Sunday Night Football yet again. Preview the game yesterday from a betting perspective. Now we get into the fantasy side of things for this one, and it's a bizarre one. Like I said yesterday talking about this game, I feel like the Bengals and the Chargers are two very differently defined teams where the Chargers want to drag you into their game and the Bengals want to beat you into submission with their offense. And so it's going to be tough to gauge which strategy, which philosophy is going to win out in this one, but it's really tantalizing when it comes to talking about who to start and who to sit and fantasy advice for this one, because I look at the Bengals and say, okay, I have a pretty defined idea of who's excellent from a fantasy perspective and who's not, and who I might want to sit. But for the Chargers, all bets are off, because I feel like the best way to beat the Bengals is just outperform them on offense, which is what the Ravens have done for their two games, which teams have done. I think the closest kind of prototype of a game in which, a team won with a more complimentary performance is that game against the Chiefs, where the defense got them that crucial touchdown and Harrison Butker kicked that game-winning field goal. That was a more complimentary performance. But I don't think necessarily the Chargers are that well equipped to do what the Chiefs did. That's why it's such a bizarre kind of game for the Chargers in terms of analyzing their fantasy prospects in it. Because I want to have more hope and optimism about this offense, because this Bengals defense is very poor. But I don't necessarily know what direction Harbaugh is going to go with it, because do you stick with the Jim Harbaugh way and hope that you can retain the ball longer, thus keeping it out of Joe Burrow's hands and try and score as many points as possible? Or do you come out guns a-blazing with a guy who's capable of it in Justin Herbert and just hand him the keys to the car and hope he can win you the football game that way? I really don't know. I think the latter is the better way to go about it, even though I don't necessarily think the Chargers have the weapons to keep up with the Bengals. But I do think that it's a great game to kind of sink our teeth into here in terms of who to start and who to sit. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's start off with the easy part of it. The Bengals. Because obviously, we know that their defense is not appealing from a fantasy standpoint, but their offense certainly is. And we know the names of the players here. So it's easy to say that Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase are immediate starts. They are, in my opinion, the best QB wide receiver duo in the National Football League. They're playing MVP caliber ball, at least for Joe Burrow, and Jamar Chase is just doing his thing. A lot of worry was placed on this duo in the offseason because of all those contract talks about Jamar Chase's dissatisfaction with how they were transpiring. But now they look very focused and primed and ready to go to try and make it into the playoffs. Because remember, this is a very tough stretch for the Bengals when they have to pull up their schedule. But starting with the Chargers, this is a schedule that's going to tighten up a little bit. They still have a lot of divisional games to play. Actually, they do have an easier schedule, but they still have to play the Steelers twice. And if they don't win those games, then that's a huge detriment to their divisional hopes because they've already lost 2 games against the Ravens, and the Steelers are going to be there and thereabouts at the end of the season. So you're going to want to at least split that series with them to try and win the tiebreaker and be the second team from the AFC North in the playoffs. So there's going to be some important games. Again, like I said, pretty balanced schedule the rest of the way for the Bengals, but you got to take care of business here, and I think they do it. And it starts with Burrow and Chase. In terms of who to sit, it is kind of bizarre to think about sitting anyone for the Bengals, but I think that it's time that T. Higgins is going to see a little bit of a decline. I feel like what I've seen from Burrow is that he has steadily been someone who knows his top 2 weapons, but this season has really evolved to distribute the wealth a little bit more. I feel like he's always been someone who's not necessarily excels too heavily in the vertical passing game. It's always been an underrated aspect of his game, and we know it's in his bag, and we know that connection with Jamar Chase can always happen. But I feel like he's going to pick you apart a lot more often this year than any other year of his career. He has different weapons underneath. You have guys like Hudson, Yoshavas, guys of that nature who can really frustrate a defense and elongate drives, sustain them, most importantly, get points on the board because you can't necessarily defend all their superstar weapons either. So that's the difficulty of determining who to sit week in, week out for the Bengals, because is Joe Burrow going to always have that explosive play in his repertoire in certain games, or is he going to pick this team apart? And I feel like for the Chargers, defensively, they feel like they can win certain matchups. So look for Joe Burrow at the start of this game to try and keep it short to intermediate in terms of his passing range, and then look for the explosive plays. That's why I feel like Higgins might suffer a little bit. He is the better route runner of the two, but I feel like when this game opens up, Joe Burrow's going to have a lot more opportunities to get Jamar Chase going than perhaps Higgins, because I feel like the Chargers want to take away as much of the middle of the field as possible. And so that's where you're going to see a lot of Joe Burrow's deep shots stem from. That clogged middle of the field where the Chargers want to account for all those secondary weapons so that they try and limit drives. But then that opens up the Burrow-Chase connection down the field. So that's why Burrow and Chase are my starts for this one for the Bengals, and Higgins might have to sit. And then, of course, in terms of a more easier benching option for the Bengals, the two running backs. I really don't see their purpose in this scheme. I feel like I want to say Chase Brown is the more late down, explosive playback, and Zach Moss kind of sets the tone in the early downs, but they're really not that defined. I feel like in terms of red zone threats and who could be more productive, Zach Moss potentially, because he's a better short yardage back. But I feel like in that two-back system, it's one of those where both are very frustrating because neither one can differentiate themselves from the other. So therefore, there's not as much balance as other two running back rooms in the National Football League. So that's why I feel like they're so puzzling from a fantasy perspective, and therefore very tough to gauge and most likely to be benched, because I really don't like them in this system and they don't necessarily work. On the Chargers side of things, however, I feel like you have to be very careful here, because Herbert, I feel like, I'm just going to out and say, could be a starter in this one, because any quarterback against the Bengals defense feel like they have an opportunity to put up huge numbers. But I feel like that little seed of doubt about whether or not Jim Harbaugh's going to allow him to has to be a big factor in that decision. That being said, I feel comfortable in knowing that Herbert is capable of doing it, and if he needs to, that's where his yardage production will come from. As Flashpoint says, I feel like a T. Higgins day is overdue. I feel like it's not necessarily gonna be his game here, because I feel like a lot of what the Bengals are gonna do is wait and pick and choose their moments to have those deep shots down the field, because I feel like that's what I said. The Chargers are going to want to take away the middle of the field, and thus T. Higgins, who I feel like is the better route runner of the two, kind of wants to work a little bit more underneath, is going to suffer a little bit, whereas I feel like the Burrow Chase deep shots are going to open up a lot more because of what the Chargers might be focused on, rather than T. Higgins' opportunities. So that's why I feel like T. Higgins is going to be there. But in terms of the Chargers, I feel like it's safe to say that Herbert knows he's capable of doing what he needs to do to win football games. And if they're in that situation, perhaps, or down by a lot, expect Herbert to throw the football more often than he would in any different game. And then, in terms of who could benefit from that, I feel like Quentin Johnston could. Because Quentin Johnston is one of those guys who I don't necessarily feel like the Bengals can account for on the back end because of his verticality. He's really coming into his own. And I feel like if that's what you want to do, if Jim Harbaugh really lets loose in this one, then why not throw it to the guy who can get most vertical in Quentin Johnston? And it's no indictment of the other guys who I have sitting here, guys like Ladd McConkey and Josh Palmer, because they're very savvy players. They could have their opportunities here and there. But if you want big, explosive plays, solid fantasy production, and hope and optimism that the Chargers can play fast and loose in this one, Quentin Johnston's your guy. I feel like you have to be thinking about this from a tactical standpoint if you have Chargers players in your lineups. Do you really feel like the Chargers are going to be a team that's going to predicate themselves on passing the football and trying to match up with this Bengals offense mano a mano? Or are they going to be stuck in their ways? And I would like to think the former, because chances are the Chargers are going to fall behind early in this game, and they might have to play catch up. So the best way to try and stay in this game from the start is to come out fast and loose. And so Herbert and Johnston are the two guys I'm looking at as potential starters to kind of help understand that sentiment But let me know what you think in the comments about this game from a fantasy pinpoint. It's a very bizarre one. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back on Monday, as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you feel so inclined. Also, continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, I am out for the week. Thank you all.